Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's video brings you news on exactly how virulent the new UK version of the CCP virus is, cockroaches turning cannibal, and some of the oldest breweries in the world. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found below. Let's begin with the CCP virus, specifically the UK variant. It's broadly been estimated that it is up to 70% more infectious. 70% more infectious would lead to considerably more mortality, as simply increasing the number of people infected does not directly correlate with the number of people dying. On the other hand, the lowest estimates indicate it could be up to 30% more infectious. A significant improvement, but it's hard to tell exactly where on that spectrum it lies. One of the current front-running theories as to why it has such a higher mortality rate is that individuals infected with the UK variant tend to have a higher viral load. This means more virus in their body. The more virus in their body, the more the immune system has to react. This means, as we noted with other studies, the more the body gets punished. Sick cells are destroyed, the virus activates the immune system leading to inflammation, and this leads to body-wide damage. It's almost like carpet bombing a city to hit a specific target. Yes, you'll hit what you're after, most likely, but there'll be a lot of collateral damage. If this is the case, then there may be ways to reduce the severity of the UK variant of the CCP virus. If not that, then other theories may have to take hold, of which there are unfortunately few at the moment. The threat of the CCP virus has led to some interesting cultural studies, specifically on how different cultures have handled the CCP virus. The gist of one study is that the more restrictive and tighter culture is when it comes to adhering to social norms, the better they fared overall. This is generally associated with stronger adherence to social norms and harsher disciplinary measures. We can see this in different countries across the world. Of course, this does raise another issue. Many of the countries that have dealt well with the CCP virus have had experience with SARS. SARS was a more aggressive and higher mortality version of the CCP virus, but it also burnt out quickly. Once you start accounting for factors like this, vaccinations and so on, you begin to see that it's the culture that's at play here, not these experiences and other factors. What most of these countries had in common was that many of them have dealt with large-scale threats before. Think of Europe in World War I and II as examples. They've had to develop a culture which has a very low tolerance for disorder in adverse situations like this. Therefore, they're better positioned to deal with threats like this. A comparison they make is that of the United States, the United Kingdom, Israel, Brazil, Spain, and Italy, versus Singapore, Japan, South Korea, China, and Austria. These two sides of the coin have had very different ways of handling the outbreak. Arguably, places like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, China, and Austria have had much more aggressive approaches to curtailing the spread. They've had strict rules and punishments for those who broke the rules. The research further found that despite the fact that the CCP virus is a threat, those who lived in countries with more liberal doctrines and cultures did not develop the cohesiveness and restrictiveness that was necessary to be similar to those countries with more restrictive and totalitarian leadership styles. This is despite the historical evidence that an outside threat, like the CCP virus, would normally lead to a cohesive and restrictive society, even if only temporarily. Now for something even more bizarre, interesting, and disgusting. Cockroaches, specifically the Salgania taiwanensis, have been filmed eating each other's wings for several days after reproduction. Although yes, generally speaking, the 4 F's of biology, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction, are closely related, they're not normally following each other in quite so literal a manner. 99% of the roaches from this species studied in the wild appeared to have stumps where their wings formerly were. This leads researchers to think that the practice is not simply something observed in captured specimens. The question was, why do these roaches spend 3 days eating each other's wings after sex? And to a slightly more gross extent, why do they take it in turns to chew in each other? It's worth noting that this particular type of roach engages in monogamy. This then asks the question, why do the roaches do this? The exact reason is not clear. In other species, eating your mate, primarily the female eating the male, gives them a quick source of energy and food, something they need after sex. Prey mantises are particularly notorious for eating their mates this way, as the wings aren't made from flesh. Removing them isn't going to cause any harm, and it could be hygienic. Another reason is that as these roaches live in wood that's rotting, the amount of space available is quite small. Removing large, bulky wings would free up some space. It also increases the chances of monogamy. If they can't travel to another home where other roaches can be found, the chances of them engaging in hanky-panky are much lower. Finally, there's another possibility, and that is simply that it reduces the chances of them being eaten by a predator. Going from the discovery of something very new to something very old, archaeologists have discovered a 5,000-year-old industrial capacity brewery. As you can imagine with this date in mind, it's in Egypt. Egypt produced a large amount of beer. At a public or government level, it was primarily used in the production of civic ventures. The pyramids come to mind, where beer was a ready source of energy, safe water, and to a certain degree nutrition. It's been estimated that the brewery could produce approximately 22,000 litres of beer at one time. This is substantially smaller than even a micro or craft brewery, which can produce 460,000 litres a year. Keeping that in mind, we need to remember that this was a very important thing in Egypt at the time, and it's one of the reasons why this was unearthed in Abydos. Abydos being a major religious centre for this time in Egypt. The process for beer in ancient Egypt is not so different to the modern process. The site contained large vessels in 8 discrete areas. There were 40 pots in each area. They contained a mixture of grains and water that was heated in these very large containers. They were then sealed temporarily and allowed to ferment. Still in the ancient Egyptian era, but looking at it with modern technology, a mummified pharaoh has been examined. Although this is not unusual, the method they used was. It began with X-rays in the 1960s, and then today we use CT scans. Both of these approaches were there to figure out what exactly would happen to the pharaoh without ever having to open the pharaoh's casket. The pharaoh was known as Seqenenre-Ptah and also known as the Brave. They lived approximately 3,500 years ago. As with most leaders from this time, when one is replaced, it's not normally because of retirement. Rather, it's violence, and either the violence at the hands of your own children or relatives, or at the hands of another country's leader. Either way, the evidence was clear. In the 1960s, the X-rays revealed a number of injuries to his head. Head injuries tend to be fairly life-ending that way. This is further supported by evidence that the embalming process was not performed as per normal. At a minimum, the salts were not used to preserve the body, and the brain was left in place. As you may know, the process of removing the brain was somewhat important. Because of the injuries identified by the X-rays, The CT scan provided even more information. It begins with the fact that the nature of the injuries sustained that led to his death occurred when either he was below the attacker, such as they were on horseback, or they were low to the ground and were then attacked. There was also the directionality of the attack and just how much damage had happened. The damage was so bad that the evidence suggested that the embalmers attempted to pack the injuries with embalming material, and this may explain why the brain was not removed. The great thing about all of this is that they never had to open the pharaoh's casket, which means that they could find out what was happening with ever having damaged the remains and destroyed, or at least damaged, a historical artifact. Going now from the ancient era to the modern day in its entirety, we need to talk about some of the social media changes that are occurring, both in Australia and America. The first of these regards Facebook. Facebook has a slight problem on its hands. The Australian government is looking to bring in a tax that requires that Facebook and other social media companies pay effectively a licensing fee to media companies to be able to distribute their content, even if it is primarily just the link. This has not been received well. Facebook's response could simply be that it would restrict anyone in Australia from sharing or viewing Australian and international news content. Google is also under a similar threat at the moment. Looking at the Facebook response, it's the same as Google holds. That is, if the government insists on doing this, we will simply not allow Australia to utilize our services. Facebook is arguing that they are different and special compared to other online services. They argue that publishers, particularly media outlets, choose to use Facebook, choose to publish their content, and that this allows them to get subscribers and increase their revenue that way. The argument is that they provide billions of free referrals to publishers, that this is worth millions of dollars a year. They argue that of all Facebook's content, assuming that they're ignoring spam, only 4% is made up of news network material. The Australian government, and other countries for that matter, aren't looking at this from nothing though. They argue that Facebook, as with places like Google, have almost a monopolistic control over advertising and online access and distribution of their information. This means that if they want subscribers in order to gain revenue, they have to be on Facebook, and Facebook acts as a gatekeeper. If they're not on Facebook, they need to advertise on Facebook. Inherently, this has a slight problem to it. They have to pay Facebook in order to then be available to develop their revenue, but that means Facebook can, by the nature of its practically monopolistic standing, exert control over that and demand whatever money they want in lieu of an alternative. If other countries were to follow suit, for example New Zealand, who are very closely involved with and related to Australia, it might become an ongoing issue where other countries were to jump on board. And if enough countries were to implement a similar law, Facebook could be in a lot more trouble, particularly when it comes to the distribution and sharing of information. With this in mind, and keeping the implications of what will happen to Facebook in the back of your mind, Google is also on the chopping block for a similar reason, although it's arguable that Google has more reason to be targeted than Facebook does. Google has effectively threatened that it will shut down its search engine functionality in Australia if the government requires that they begin paying news sites to link to their articles. Fundamentally, the same sort of taxation or licensing agreement as Facebook is currently under, or will be under. The short issue here is that unlike Facebook, where agencies and media will actively promote and submit their content and then distribute it, Google doesn't quite work that way. If you go to the front page of Google and type in any generic term, there's a good chance you'll be given enough information that you don't need to go any further than that Google search result page to get what you need. This is one reason why Google has for the most part claimed that they have an incredibly high retention rate of people never having to leave their own ecosystem in order to get the information that they need. One of the reasons that Google can get away with this is that they both have influence on their ad revenue and payments for exactly where and how they rank results. If you have a more favorable arrangement with Google, your results are shown first. If you have a less favorable arrangement, or if you don't agree to certain terms and conditions, you are pushed down the ranking. This means that Google makes a lot of money out of people for very little. This is where a new law in America, coming out of Maryland, is going to be a problem for them. The law is simple. It will tax big tech's revenue, ad revenue specifically, and it's going to be a real problem for Google, Facebook, and more if it passes legal muster. As we've mentioned, places like Facebook and Google get a lot of money from people, and a lot of people never have to leave their platforms in order to access the information that they want. There's been ongoing debate about taxing them and how best to do it, since these companies are very effective at dodging tax. This has been shown by repeated congressional and other government testimony where the government grilled them about exactly what tax they were paying, where, and for what. Companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon are the ones that come to mind first, but even companies like Apple and Microsoft are not exempt. This also follows the antitrust lawsuits being brought against Google and Facebook. These taxes are intended to target the ad revenue in particular. Ad revenue largely built on the data obtained from users. Facebook and Google both obtain massive amounts of user data, both on an individual level and a collective level. This is also not a flat rate tax. Rather, it's a progressive tax with two steps. Between $100 million a year and $1 billion a year globally, there's a 2.5% tax. If you produce more than $15 billion a year, there's a 10% tax. The obvious consequence to this will be that big companies begin charging more for ad space to compensate for this tax. Fortunately, and somewhat difficultly, Maryland is attempting to bring in a second piece of legislation that would prevent exactly that solution. This is not necessarily a novel option. Places like France and Austria both have similar tax on digital revenue. France imposes 3% and Austria 5%. The idea here is that Europe has done it, and at least arguably with some success, as the pushback from Facebook and similar has not been as extreme. But these were countrywide taxes, not state level. And if you have 50 some taxes being applied to a company, the numbers add up very quickly. That's all the news we have for you this week. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.